Hello, my name's Lanham Napier. I have the honor to be the moderator for this panel. So what we're going to do in terms of framing the discussion today is I'll introduce our panelists, Nita and Charlie. They'll give you a background about their companies and their research endeavors and interests. From there, we'll start our conversation and we'll have a Q&A from the audience as well. So to the extent you have a question, please log in, give us the question, we'll get to it. We've got about 75 minutes together. So we're super excited about this and we're happy to be here with you today. So with that, I'll tell you a little bit about me, but it's not going to last very long, so I'm not nearly as interesting as Charlie and Nita. So my background, I am just a business entrepreneur guy. Okay, so my fascination with technology started with the fact that I was born the son of a computer scientist. I was an entrepreneur who helped build Rackspace here in San Antonio, Texas for years. It was my honor to be CEO of that company. I now spend my time as an investor trying to do for other entrepreneurs what wasn't done for me, mainly to show up with operating experience in a long-term perspective so their teams and companies can pursue greatness. Okay, but so we're past that part. Now let's get to the real part. So let me give you a little bit of background on Nita. All right, so here we have with us Nita Madhav. She's the CEO of Metabiota, which is a super cool company. And as we get into that company, I think what you'll see is that the company is really purpose-built for these moments in time. I mean, it is a company who's at its core helps governments around the world deal with epidemic risk. They measure, manage, and help governments mitigate that risk. She's been on this journey and path for her career. It is super impressive, and I think we're going to learn a ton from her. To give you a little bit about her background, she has a BS from the mighty Yale University up in New Haven, Connecticut. That bachelor's degree is in ecology and evolutionary biology. Nita's super ambitious. So past that, she went and got a master's degree in epidemiology from Emory University. So clearly an expert in probabilistic risk and modeling and has great experience here dealing with the COVID pandemic with which the world's trying to navigate. In addition to Nita, we have Charlie Burgoyne. Charlie's the founder and CEO of Valkyrie AI. All right, so we've got evolutionary biology with Nita. With Charlie, we've got theoretical physics. All right, so he got a BS in astrophysics from George Washington. He then followed that with a master's degree from Georgetown in theoretical physics. So what does a guy do who's a physicist? He starts your career out at NASA. So he started at NASA and the DOE before really embracing AI and founding Valkyrie. And Valkyrie is a very interesting company. It has interests in auto racing and does a bunch of artificial intelligence and data science programs for state governments and some of the most innovative companies on the planet. All right, so with that, why don't we hand it over to Nita to share a few minutes with the background of her company.
All right, thanks, Lanham. And happy to be here today. Thanks so much for having me. I'm just going to talk to you for a couple minutes about what we're doing at Metabiota, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation we're going to have today. So at Metabiota, our mission is to make the world more resilient to epidemics. We provide data analytics and expertise to help governments, agencies, and the private sector prepare for global health threats. We've developed a database of over 2,600 historical epidemics. We track them in near real time. And we also do modeling, especially with an angle of looking at future risk. And so this is something that's very near and dear to us. So we apply it both towards risk mitigation as well as some work in risk transfer actually in the insurance sector. The company was founded in 2008, based in San Francisco. It started out on viral discovery and capacity building, a lot of work for governments. And then more recently, we started building out the data science and computational epidemiology group as well. And we also highly value scientific engagement and publication. And so we've spent quite a bit of time publishing a lot of the work that we've done. And we have quite a few key partnerships with governments, with the multilateral agencies, and with the private sector. We use a lot of big data tools to better understand epidemics, and especially AI. So we use natural language processing to process lots of narrative reports that are unstructured data and to put them into a structured format. A lot of times these do form a leading edge of information before health authorities start officially reporting it. We also use a lot of machine learning to understand where diseases may emerge in the future, hotspots, and lots of different data sets feed into that. And then we also use large-scale simulations, understanding that the data that are available and that can be collected is really just a subset of what's possible. And so a lot of what we do in the large-scale simulation front is to understand the possible frequency and severity of these events. And we do that by doing hundreds of thousands and millions of simulations of different types of epidemics, running them through computational epidemiological model, and then having various different parameter combinations that are probabilistically weighted. We house all of this in our data and analytic toolset, which is the epidemic risk software platform called GEM. And all of the data, the indices that we build to help gauge preparedness levels and the level of fear that epidemics can cause, and the models are all housed within this. We also have an open website called epidemictracker.com, where some of this is also available. And of course, we're always excited to talk to folks who are interested to collaborate on these works. During COVID-19, we've been very busy, even very early on, before it was recognized as a global pandemic. So we provide not only the data and analytic tools, but also support on the ground in disease hotspots around the world. And so some of our work was actually on those on-the-ground activities, providing technical guidance and logistics coordination for field partners in many countries, but primarily in Cameroon, Sierra Leone, and DRC, where we have field teams located. And then in our data and analytic tools, we use open source intelligence to gather the data for media reports, estimate risk to travelers and Transit Hub, and then the sentiment score that we have estimates the level of fear that epidemics can cause. And then lastly, modeling and forecasting, especially early on when those tools were not widely available. So we had provided risk reports that were publicly available, and one of these kind of landed in the hands of a company that worked on event software, and actually in early January they received word of this and were able to pivot their business model with 6 weeks of lead time compared to their competitors, which was very beneficial for their company. And so we do have a case study on that. Could be interesting for folks to have a look at. So we've been very busy with that, kind of responding to what we've been called on to do with various agencies and with multilateral groups and with the private sector. And what we really are focusing on is to make sure that the lessons that we learned from COVID are really put into action, and that we really move from a reactive approach to epidemic risk more to a proactive approach. There's a lot that we can do before an epidemic. We can identify data sources, we can do simulation modeling and risk analytics. And when we talk about risk, what are we really talking about? It's to understand the probability that something will happen and the likelihood that it will cause human and economic losses. So that's really what we want to understand. We can increase preparedness, we can create contingency plans, and all of these things are things that we should be able to get into place and incorporate the lessons that we've learned from COVID. So with that, that's kind of all I had for the beginning here, and maybe I'll turn it back over to Lanham.
Thank you, Nita. I mean, that is fascinating stuff, and part of our panel here, we look forward to exploring with you, some of these issues around risk and which geographies handled it well, and the state of preparedness when when COVID decided to surface, for humanity. Before we get in all that, though, let's go over to Charlie Burgoyne. And so, Charlie, if you could just spend a few minutes, helping the audience understand, your background in Valkyrie and how you guys really helped out here, particularly in the state of Texas, with the COVID challenge.
Absolutely. I'm such a pleasure to join y'all today. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Excited to talk with Nita and Lanham, two very impressive folks. To tell you a little bit about Valkyrie at a high level, we're a team of scientists that we're really trying to reinvigorate the fervor for science of the mid-20th century. So we like to think of ourselves as a modern day Bell Labs. That's a lofty moniker to assert, but we're really excited about the different ways in which applied the application of algorithms and machine learning are having an impact in different industries. We do a lot of different work in different spaces, commercial work, and then also federal work in the defense and intelligence space. But today we want to talk a little bit about how we apply different things into this pandemic, right? So our core operation is really our intelligence practice, which is a bespoke machine learning and applied science team. And we develop all sorts of algorithms, knowledge systems, deep learning systems in some instances, in order to solve really interesting problems. Additionally, we have an investment vehicle. We do a lot of investments for asset projection. We're really big on philanthropy and gave away over $500,000 of work last year for different causes that we're supporting. And then for fun, we actually have a racing team where we compete in 5 different series with 14 cars, optimizing their performance through techniques of machine learning. But to understand really how we were able to address some of the issues with the pandemic, it's kind of important for us to understand the Valkyrie perspective on the nature of intelligence, specifically the application of quote unquote AI. We've got a lot of physicists on the team, mathematicians, biologists, chemists as well. But this is kind of a physicsy perspective that we've developed. There's kind of 2 different fields for artificial intelligence. We have pattern recognition, which includes machine learning, computational biology, and then computational statistics rather, and then various techniques in understanding patterns that exist in data, latent and explicit, that are derived from fields like computational biology or computational physics, computational chemistry. So you can think of pattern recognition as kind of the thing that most people get the most attention for when you're reading a Wired article about AI. But the other problem that not a lot of people put attention to is the problem of knowledge engineering. And that's turning data from a format that's digitally optimized into one that's semantically optimized, right? We don't think in bits, we don't think in binary, we don't think in structures that are super similar to relational databases or SQL tables or even unstructured databases like MongoDB or other document-oriented databases. We actually think in a really complex, nuanced way where we're interconnecting things and more akin to graph databases or graph theory. And it's actually pretty fascinating to figure out how different problems can be solved in that way. But one of the biggest things that we learned during the pandemic was that because people have been optimizing for data storage in a way that's optimizing for cost and minimizing computational load, it actually made it really difficult to understand some of the nuances and patterns of the pandemic that ended up having a really big impact on different locations. We'll talk a lot about that, I hope, today. It's a fascinating problem. So we do all sorts of different types of things. Sometimes I feel like I'm the Forrest Gump of science. I get exposed to all sorts of really cool problems. We work with Formula One teams and investors, media conglomerates, do a lot of things in telecommunications. We even help Carnival Cruise Lines clean up the ocean. So lots of really fun different projects, and it gives us a really interesting perspective. But at the end, we really are only doing one thing, which is understanding the nature of intelligence, nature of knowledge, and then articulating that information, that knowledge, in such a way that patterns can be availed through different applications of computational methods, whether it's investments or and predicting the asset value or predicting how well we're going to do at the Indianapolis 500. It's all around, the process remains the same for us. Throughout today, if you have any questions, I'd really love to engage on the pandemic, but of course, any other subject as well. You can learn more about us at valkyrie.ai. And if you have any questions, drop us a line at inquiries@valkyrie.ai. And please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. All right.
Okay. Thank you, Charlie and Nita. So in terms of starting out here to frame this conversation, one way to look at this is we have the macro with Nita and Metabiota, who's been purpose built for moments like this. Have been working with government for years and building models and trying to manage this risk. And then we have the micro with Charlie, where Valkyrie went deep with the state of Texas to actually build out a model on a county level. So why don't we start with some of the macro conversation around Nita, what y'all saw on a global basis as COVID started to emerge, and then we'll come back to Texas, because look, let's face it, as Texans, we feel like we live in the greatest state, the greatest country in the history of humanity. All right, so it's going to be important to talk about Texas, and then from there, we can have a debate and scrimmage around who did it well, who didn't do it well, how prepared are we for next time, et cetera. So start us down this path. I mean, I would say the first question is, in your slides, you talked about having a database of 2,600 epidemics. How has COVID performed relative to those other epidemics? Is it what the model said it would be? Is it, amazingly similar or dissimilar? How, from your bird's eye view, How has it played out?
Well, great question there. And I think, compared to everything else we have in the database, it blows everything out of the water. And, maybe going all the way back to 1918 is really when we had this very large global scale event. There had been other influenza pandemics subsequently in 1957 and 1968, but the scale we're seeing here is quite large compared to what we've seen in, say, the past 30 years. But it shouldn't be something that takes us by surprise because, we, along with others, had warned for years that this type of event could occur. And it's something that, can be responded to. Now, some of the things that we did prior to COVID, we had actually done an assessment of over 200 countries around the world related to how well prepared they would be to handle an event such as this. How prepared would they be to detect and respond to these events? And so it's pretty interesting to see that some countries performed as expected to what the preparedness assessments kind of suggested, or how they suggested they would perform, whereas others really performed below expectation.
Nita, can I stop you right there? Could you just help us sort of from a base rate point of view? When you say assessing preparedness, like what's in that?
So it's a really good question. So in the preparedness assessments, we a lot of the ones prior to the one that we put together really just looked at public health capacities, medical infrastructure, how many hospital beds are there, how many doctors per capita, which of course are very important metrics. But one thing that we also found in that assessment is that there are other supporting factors that also need to be taken into account. And these include economic factors, communications abilities, as well as political factors, which we found have figured quite heavily in the COVID pandemic. And I think, one of the key contributors to a lot of countries that didn't perform as compared to how we might have expected, there did appear to be a political component in response to that. There are a lot of very difficult challenges in responding to an epidemic or pandemic. Often it's described as being in the fog of war. So it's, certainly people are trying to make the best decisions they can with the information they have. And so it's always important to recognize that. But, what we found is that, I think a question that comes up a lot is how do you define success in a pandemic?
Yeah.
Because there's more than one way to do it. Of course, kind of the metric that people look at often is the numbers of infections and hospitalizations and deaths. Have those been kept as low as possible? But I think the important thing to keep in mind there is that there are a lot of differences in reporting, capacities to detect, to report what's going on, testing, and even identifying cause of death. So even having some numbers, it's difficult to compare between countries. But even so, we can kind of glean from the data that are available some patterns that we see. So those kind of important metrics like cases and deaths, of course, you want to try to keep those low. And there's also the question of equity, access to healthcare, and now vaccination. But there's a whole other dimension, which is the financial impacts. And so, the economic impacts are going to be coupled with the amounts of cases and deaths that are observed. But what we found, looking at prior epidemics, as you had brought up, that a lot of the fear from small or events that are smaller, the economic loss is actually driven by fear and not just the kind of case and death count. So in this event early on, we noticed that the characteristics of the virus, of the way that it spread, kind of gave it a higher fear score. And so that indicated even early on that this would likely be an event of high economic consequence. And then the third thing is on the kind of political will, leadership, kind of acting quickly and soundly, working closely with scientists, with epidemiologists, and really trying to be able to take all the viewpoints and kind of come up with the best solution. Maybe it kind of isn't what one group wants or what the other group wants, but it's sort of a, the kind of the best path. And so what we found is countries that really kind of reacted very decisively, where leadership took the health threat seriously, and then had science-backed responses, like very early on. Those are the ones that kind of kept case numbers to lower, and then that kind of kept them out from getting into the really high growth phase. Because you can see that with these events, after it reaches a certain size, after a number of cases, it just reaches this tipping point where it's nearly impossible to contain in the short term. So prevention and early action are really key to limiting the human and economic loss from these types of events. Yep. So some of the countries that had really aggressive initial responses and territories or locations like Singapore, South Korea, New Zealand, Taiwan, Australia, Vietnam, all of those had really aggressive initial responses and kind of kept things at bay sufficiently. And
so that's fascinating. So one more question here before we get over to Charlie. So it sounds like from your answer, some of the countries that you think played it really well were these last few you mentioned, Singapore, South Korea, Vietnam, New Zealand. It's interesting how they're clustered in one part of the world, by the way. They sort of, that's sort of interesting observation. Okay. And so would you say that I assume their performance is correlated to the fact that they had a high degree of preparedness?
So many of those countries were prepared. They had, previous experience with avian flu and also with SARS. And so they just had really aggressive responses and actions. And so that, really played in. And I think the other piece of it too is that, the public was, perhaps more willing to go along with those policies, especially at the, just from that prior experience having gone through those other events. I think that.
Yeah. I mean, this is a multivariable thing, right? We got to have the data. We got to have the ability to respond. People have to believe their leadership. This is all fascinating stuff. And so there's a macro view of which, countries were prepared, and it played out pretty well. And then, Charlie, with your work in Valkyrie's work with the state of Texas, let's do a little bit of a micro view. And so you're listening, reflecting on what Nita says about, the practice that some of these other countries had with avian flu and SARS and others. Texas hadn't had that practice, and residing in Texas, we know how it's played out. Okay. And, it's had some amazing moments and had some tough moments too. And so can you just describe, Valkyrie's role working with the state, the type of models you were able to create, how predictive that stuff has been and just how it's played out?
Sure. It was a really tumultuous couple of weeks when everything broke out. Not long after we started, we had the good fortune of being asked by a company called GMR, which is the largest ambulance company in the world. Really good people, company that we've enjoyed working with tremendously. And they asked us to basically help them identify which regions were going to develop COVID and what rate, so that they were looking at the demand in New Jersey and New York and the demand in Las Vegas. And all of a sudden, nobody's going to Las Vegas anymore. So we moved ambulances over to New York and New Jersey. And it's kind of a simplification, but that's basically what they asked us to do. And so our work actually started by looking at what was considered at the time the best model for COVID, and then transferring that into a very localized application. That was the IHME model. That came out of University of Washington. So we figured out a way to kind of hybridize that with some ensemble techniques to get that to be viable at the county level. So that's where it started. And then we were actually asked by a big contractor for the state to come in and support the state of Texas. And I'll say, we were with the state as part of their task force for several months. And it's just an incredibly to your point, Lanham, it's a multivariate problem. It's extremely complex. We were looking to different examples of different areas that seemed to be handling it well. South Korea definitely came up. And what we quickly identified is like, well, they're really effective for a couple of reasons. They're the 85% of the population lives in a single city. They've got very limited vectors of ingress into the country that can be relatively well maintained, and they have mandated conscription, which meant that they have a whole working body of 18 to 20-year-olds, I think is the age range, that they could use to clean the streets of Seoul every night. And so we tried our very best to figure out how some of those models would be applicable, and how the IHME model was going to be valuable for the state. And actually, some of those things lined up, but really, we were noticing that there was just no way of applying those at that scale. So what did we do instead? We kind of turned the problem upside down. And to your point, Lanham, we thought about the micro application. So when everybody's locked down aggressively at the beginning of the pandemic, we saw that as an opportunity to perform some A/B tests as to what the vectors of transmission really were, so that we could satiate both the epidemiologists and the econometricians who were really desperately trying to balance livelihood and lives in Texas, which is kind of the objective of all states. We did some support from some other states as well, and that was the trend. So when the state locked down aggressively, we decided we were going to take a look at how people were still getting food. And maybe the food distribution was going to be a vector for the pandemic that we were going to be able to understand better. My hypothesis, which was not really, it was not empirically based, was that areas in Texas, or actually throughout the country, but specifically throughout Texas, where the predominant source of food was drive-through restaurants, very fast food locations, as opposed to a variety of different grocery stores and big box retailers. There's probably 4 or 5 different classes we considered, and we were able to identify counties that were really dependent on one space. So what you think of as like a food desert, where there's only fast food, we were able to look at those counties and identify how the food was, the pandemic was transmitting. My hypothesis was completely wrong. The counties that were highly dependent on fast food were not actually a transmission vector, right? My thought was, we have all of these people who are going through the same drive-through, and maybe that cashier would be a vector. We noticed something that was startling, though, and which was that grocery stores, for some reason, had a very, very, very strong the dependence on a grocery store for a region had a very strong correlation to the rate at which the pandemic was spreading. And so we called a number of people. We had a conversation with the folks at GMR, the ambulance company I mentioned, the state of Texas, FEMA, and we said, there's something going on with this virus. Unlike every other coronavirus we'd ever seen, there's something about this virus that is allowing it to be aerosolized effectively, to live in environments that we didn't think were really tenable for a virus of this kind. And grocery stores are actually potentially a very serious transmission vector, which obviously is quite alarming. So the way we thought about understanding this virus, which really doesn't fit a profile of traditional COVIDs, as I mentioned, was to think about human behavior, the limited human behavior during quarantine, and get an understanding for how these vectors were effective.
Yeah, so that's super interesting. So I'd love to hear from both of y'all around, because you guys have big brains, can do the math around the predictability of these models. So Nita, you talked about how some regions performed above expectations, below expectations, or at expectations, and that's linked to a level of preparedness and political will and other factors. And then Charlie, you talk about how starting out with the first model, there were just errors in that model. As we look at it, as you reflect back on it today, and I know we're still in the middle of this, but as you reflect on it today, is the math holding? Are the models holding? Are the models getting better? What is the confidence interval tightening on these things? I mean, how do you feel about that? Nita, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I know, I think everyone who's been involved in forecasting for this particular event has, taken the brunt of, various types of, criticisms, or just, I think there's a lot that there's unknown. And I think, there's something to be said about modelers being able to communicate the results, to be able to communicate the level of uncertainty, because these types of tools will always have uncertainty in them. And early on, very early on in an epidemic or pandemic, there was a lot that's unknown. Those models require parameters to work, and the models are really only as good as the data that feed into them. So early on, I think a couple of things that we noticed about this coronavirus, that there were similarities with some prior coronaviruses, in the sense that super spreading seemed to be a very important factor. So I think that's something very important to keep in mind, because there's that kind of like really adds to the level of this element of chance that's in it, because you can you can kind of have the same level of exposure, but there's this kind of binary sort of outcome in some cases, like either it goes to super spreading or not. That can really make a big difference in in how the event plays out. I think the other thing to keep in mind about forecasting is that it does really need to be dynamic. This is, in the middle of an event. Unlike other types of events where forecasting is happening, like weather or hurricanes or things like that, these are events where people's actions can actually change the course of the event. So even though one week you may have a forecast that something might happen, the next week a lot has changed on the ground. People have taken those forecast results to heart and maybe have changed some of their behaviors. So it's a bit of a feedback loop. So even, these types of estimates are constantly changing. And I think that's, another thing that's really important to keep in mind. I think today we know more about the virus. I think the models have gotten better, but I think what we've also seen is that there's still a lot that relies on the human element and behaviors and things, decisions that people make that aren't necessarily as easy to model as, just something that's just a physical process.
This is the tough part about humans being predictably irrational. It makes it hard to model us at times. And Charlie, in y'all's work, have the models for the state gotten better? How do you feel about it?
Well, so we haven't engaged with the state for a while. I think the last time we developed a model for them was in November. At the time, we were working on basically go back to school plans and how to mitigate the virus in enclosed environments such as prisons and other facilities. So I couldn't tell you specifically about how the models that are currently being deployed are functioning at the state. I will say that in the work that we're doing, to touch on that last point, the evolution of human behavior is actually really fascinating during this time. It does complicate the modeling, and it actually has big implications on different industries too. We're at a point where I kind of think of this whole episode as having three different phases. There was the behavior that we exhibited right before the pandemic, the behavior we're exhibiting during the pandemic, and then the behavior that we'll exhibit post-pandemic. I don't think post and pre are going to look completely similar. I think we've exploited, or we identified a lot of inefficiencies in different markets and industries that we'll exploit moving forward. And I think that's a good thing, right? We basically got a free control, delete on civilization. So there are the silver lining to this whole situation is that we will see some optimizations of behavior. So what we have been doing, and we've been doing a couple of thought leadership pieces around this, including one that'll be published with Forbes shortly, is all around how different firms have been able to capitalize on techniques such as deep learning and reinforcement learning to inform some of their fiduciary models are actually going to be optimized for the post-pandemic situation, because the firms that have been using classical models for all of their projections are suddenly in a very bad spot because they have data that's no longer saying it. So human behavior is evolving. The firms that have data or systems that don't depend on vast decades of data are actually going to be in a very, very strong position. And unfortunately, in terms of further segmenting markets, the firms that were affording reinforcement learning approaches before are the ones who already had an advantage before the pandemic. So it will really exacerbate some of the haves and have-nots in different industries because of the permutations of behavior.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And Nita, you said something a few minutes ago that I found super provocative, actually. And it's this notion earlier about the SPHERE score. And in a prior conversation that the three of us had, you talked about the need for these early warning detection systems. And it's just striking to me that the better the early warning detection system, the more likely we could manage the fear, or at least be able to shape the message around the fear. So I'd love to, I think it'd be interesting for the audience to hear your perspective around, what do you mean by an early warning system? What type of information and data should flow out of that? And then how could leaders, use that more effectively?
Well, it's a great question, and I'm sure we could devote an entire session just on this. But there's a lot of work going on right now with many different agencies, with foundations that are trying to stand up these type of early warning systems. I think what we have seen and have seen in many prior epidemics is that a lot of times the information that's available for decision making is lagged, and it's because of the way that the health systems report it to authorities like ministries of health, and then so that it kind of has to move up the chain. And there are a lot of places for that data to kind of get lost. So even at the very outset, if somebody, the first case may or may not ever be found, may not seek medical attention, may not be tested, so diagnosis is not made, may fall off in the reporting chain. So there's a lot of areas where there are lags, there's underreporting, and that really makes it hard to make appropriate decisions when the data are still not there. And so what these early warning systems would do, first of all, is to kind of take care of this last mile problem where really that very first initial case would be detected and would kind of get reported right away. But a lot of work that's going on right now is more on using different types of data sources. Diagnostics are a really important area where there's a lot of work going on how to better have integration between different data sets, how to have that reporting happening quickly. But there are a lot of other tools that can be used, whether it's media reports, social media, even using weather patterns to anticipate how things could be, how could they unfold. So it's about trying to detect those earliest signals of what might be happening, where hotspots might be, even where diseases might emerge, where might an epidemic or a pandemic emerge before it even becomes an event. So a lot of work is going on in those areas. And so, the goal is to just get ahead of this curve, because I think one of the things that really, can contribute to a lot of losses occurring is kind of a reactionary approach. So, you start to see the cases increase it, and then you're like, oh, okay, we got to do something. But by the time they're already on that, really large upward trajectory, it's really going to be difficult to get it to come back down. So what we want to do ideally is to prevent it from getting to that stage. And so that's what a lot of the early warning systems are aiming to do.
And your experience with COVID, when did you and your firm have a real good sense that this thing was going to be bigger than people thought, or had the potential to be bigger than people thought? I'm interested in what the timing disconnect is there, or gap rather.
Yeah, so we started picking it up in late December. Other groups did as well, when there started to be media reports of an unknown respiratory illness occurring in Wuhan, China. And then, so we started, it got into our system, and we were kind of watching it to see what it would do. Would this be, another event that kind of peters out, or would it turn into something bigger? And it was about towards the kind of the second week of January when we kind of saw, information started coming in about how it spread, and that there, like the number of cases that were undetected at first and things like that. So that type of information fed into our system and kind of told us that, oh, this is going to be worse than a lot of things we've seen in the recent past. So that's when we started, structuring the data, collecting it methodically, and putting it into the system so that it could start to be used for decision making. And that was, pretty well ahead of when, it was finally declared a pandemic in March.
Well, yeah, that's fascinating. So Charlie, so imagine we've got this early warning system that meets all of NITA's requirements,
Mhm.
right? We have the multiple data sources, and you're able to, construct this model for the state. Realizing model is just an abstraction of reality, and so there's the insertion of chance and probabilistic features.
Yeah.
Okay, but how should we think about and explore how to shape that so that it's usable by policymakers? So I do think, just keeping up with y'all's expertise on this session is a challenge for me. I mean, you guys are experts in this. The math is interesting, and when I think about the politician's role or the policymaker's role, boy, that's hard. I mean, they've got so many constituents, so many different types of problems, and opportunities. And in your experience working with the state, I mean, how do we go from these mathematical abstractions of reality to make it usable for policymakers to make as good a decision as possible, realizing there's no perfect decision in this stuff? I mean, nothing's 100%.
It's a really good question. And I think Nita hit a couple of the points right on the head, which is this siloing of different data and in institutional knowledge that's unable to transfer from one space to another, especially within a regionalized government, is a challenge. It's a big problem, and it wasn't a problem unique to Texas. It's a problem to all countries and states and counties. It's a very the rules that we set into place to make sure that people are accountable and responsible for data sets are actually one of the things that created some real challenges, especially in the West, for understanding how the virus was spreading. Countries that do not have the same respect for civil liberties or privacy, including the Chinese government, didn't have that same problem, right? All of their data was centralized and very well articulated, and they were extremely precise, and they have a different operating procedure when it comes to cultural appropriation of data. Civil liberties, rather. So, without going down that particular tangent, I will say that Nita's spot on. The siloing is a big problem, and what we actually advocated for, and it's actually a consideration right now that we're working with the state government around, is creating a horizontal capability at the governor's office around a chief data officer type role, an individual whose primary responsibility and their department's primary responsibility is to transcend some of the accountability issues and the siloing issues that really that can get in the way when you're making a major decision. So that how do we know all of all the data sets reside within the Commerce Department or within the state health systems or emergency management systems? How do we get to the point where a single group is able to act in a completely nonpartisan, completely scientifically derived way that can bring all those sets together and then report back and provide policy direction? It's not an easy problem to solve for, but I think we have some exemplifications of this working really well. I actually think that the former Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, was a very good advocate for exactly this kind of empirically data-driven decision-making perspective. And she has a PhD in quantum chemistry. She's no dummy, and she really thought about how different groups and departments and organizations within Germany could work together to make sure that the decisions they were making not only was informed by data, but was defensible by data. I think that's a big problem that we have in a variety of places domestically, is that it's hard for politicians to make a decision that's empirically based without having the extremely polarized partisanship that we're dealing with now come to factor. And I know personally, I operate in a very nonpartisan way, as humanly possible. Being able to be comfortable talking to people of different parties and different ideologies from a scientific perspective was actually considered refreshing by both sides of the aisle. And that's actually how we were able to implement some policies, is we didn't ostracize anybody on the left or anybody on the right. We talked to them and we were very candid about the priorities of these different departments and groups. That's a super, that's a waning cultural phenomenon. And I'm actually very concerned on a variety of subjects, including climate change and how we're going to stay competitive in different markets from an econometrics perspective. The fact that science is being polarized is actually one of the reasons I think we had such a hard time reacting to the virus. That's kind of a long-winded way of answering your question, Lanham, but in short, we need to have a nonpartisan group that's responsible for overlooking or overseeing all the data within a group, that's accountable to political entities for sure, the people for sure, but is singularly focused on making sure that policy is empirically substantiated.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I mean, to me, it's just fascinating that how we can, I think the math is hard anyway. Building out the models is hard. Leading people, that's a challenge. Getting people to follow the advice is a challenge. And it's fascinating to me around just the more centralized approach of certain countries that were able to pull it off in this battle of privacy versus, liberties versus, the collective kind of thing. I mean, it's a fascinating example. So with that, so we're down to about 15 minutes now. Nita, something that's super topical is what's transpiring in India. It's talk about potential super spreader. It's a happening. So what are the models saying now for that? I mean, what is your firm's view of what's happening there?
Well, it really is, terrible what's going on there. Earlier it had seemed that perhaps they had kind of dodged a bullet, and now it seems that it's very far from that. I think the unfortunate thing there is that India does have, a lot of things that should be helping, like they've done large-scale immunization programs for other diseases like polio and tetanus. They have lots of highly trained doctors and scientists and powerful network of community health workers. But, once the event reaches a certain size, everything starts to get overwhelmed. And it's, to some extent, it's better late than never if there's, now, various types of measures done to help reduce spread and transmission, and even lockdowns and things like that. But I think right now they have a challenge with the data as well, because it's difficult without the widespread testing. With the vaccine rollout is not going very quickly there either. I think so far it's really not looking very good. There need to be some drastic changes for there to be kind of to stem the tide of what's going on.
So if you were in charge of India, what would you do? Do you have any, what was sort of your top 3 or 4 moves?
Well, gosh, that's a really tough question. I think it's, ideally it wouldn't have gone to this point. Ideally, there would have been, more preventive actions ahead of time. I think everybody has pandemic fatigue right now. I think it's, we're really not out of the woods yet, and we don't want to kind of be premature about just, kind of going back to the way everything was, 100%. I think, like Charlie was saying, a data-driven approach to kind of opening things up and things like that. I mean, I think right now, the fact that India is going to be, getting assistance from other countries, opening up the ability to get the materials they need to make vaccines and things like that. I think all of that is just going to be critical, because at some point the system is overwhelmed, and it's really, comes to the point that there does need to be outside help. So I think any and all help should be accepted at this point, and just kind of sitting tight, trying to alleviate the fear. I mean, it's a very difficult challenge right now, and it's something that unfortunately has played out in many countries, but now with the situation in India has really kind of become the kind of the representative for how things could really go badly.
Yeah, and then to me, I mean, we live in amongst these interconnected systems, and the ability to segment the risk and keep it, even though it feels, here in Texas, it feels like India is a long way away. We're amazingly tethered to India, and whether it's human flows or physical goods flows, information flows. I mean, we are certainly joined at the hip with India in many ways. And so as we start to send resources over there, what's Charlie and Nita, what's y'all's take on the status here in the U.S.? I mean, we're having this foot race between viruses mutating, vaccination in our population to reach herd immunity, or getting herd immunity the old-fashioned way with enough people getting sick before the darn thing mutates again. What's based on y'all's informed views? I mean, how do what's the state of the U.S.? How do you see it today with where we are?
So I think that there are definitely some really good markers for where we sit right now. There are a couple of big caveats, right? I mean, recent guidance from the CDC, some of the models that they were using, and in fact, they came out and publicly talked about that. They were worried about kind of a doomsday scenario with some of the more relaxed policies that were being enacted at the state level. As it turns out, the model is showing that it's waning, despite the fact that a lot of the country is opening up. Now, there's some exceptions to that. But so that's kind of where I think the good news ends. What I'm particularly concerned about, and our team's particularly concerned about, is watching the data from India. It does indicate that the R naught is potentially much more aggressive with the strain that's in India than we had anticipated. And what we mean by that is that if you look at how aggressively the virus is spreading, and you match that to the rate at which positive tests have been taken, positive results on the tests have come back, it is quite alarming. There is a disconnect there, and some people estimate that India's positive rate is as much as 30 times what it's being reported as, which is really, really scary. It also, because of the rate at which it's spreading in the environments in which it's spreading in India, the concern for aggressive mutations is quite high. It's kind of a perfect environment for aggressive mutations to occur. And let's not forget, the 1918's first wave was actually pretty manageable. There were a lot of elderly people who perished in the first wave of the 1918 flu, but it was really a mutation that occurred. I'm sure Nita would know exactly where it occurred. For some reason, I believe I've heard it was in the trenches of France, is where the mutation that eventually killed off people between the ages of 20 and 35, where that actually occurred. But it was the second wave that was very dangerous. So we're on a high alert still from an epidemiological standpoint to monitor how these mutations are occurring. We're watching to see if we get a better understanding of the R naught, the true R naught, by watching what's going on in India. Depending on that, we might actually find that we're closer to herd immunity based off of India's data than we actually thought. That's possible for sure, but the big risk is what happens there and how new mutations develop.
Nita, what's your view of the state of the pandemic response and how we're doing in the U.S. these days based on the models that y'all are running?
Well, I think it's true that the vaccination levels are improving, and so I think that's a big help. I think the question of the variants is one that is still very concerning. There could be some that come up that are that may escape vaccine immunity, that may evade the kind of treatments that are now available, and so I think it all points to the need for enhanced surveillance to pick those things up as soon as they, as soon as we see them, so that we can have that information in hand and be able to act quickly and decisively when needed.
Okay, and so so we're down to just 6 minutes here. So I wanted to give each of y'all the opportunity, if you were monarch of the world for a day. Okay, so assume you are the supreme being. Okay, and you get to inform the population around with respect to pandemics. Here are 2 or 3 things you really need to know. What are the 2 or 3 things you want to make sure our audience today understands when it comes to tracking and responding and predicting these pandemics? I mean, based on your informed view and experience, working with different companies, different governments, on a global and micro basis. I mean, what are the insights and lessons here over the past 18 months you've been able to derive from this?
Yeah, happy to take a first stab. So the first thing is that there's conflation of politics and science, and that's a problem. We really need to create an environment where people can trust science, trust where it's coming from, and trust the governments that are turning that science into policy. And I think governments need to express that, like we talked about before. That's really a really important feature. Decisions need to be data driven. They absolutely have to. The other thing is that there's a author who I'm a pretty big fan of named Nassim Taleb, And Talib talks about 3 different states for any system. You can be fragile, where you get exposed to chaos and crack and break. You can be robust, where you get exposed to chaos and you're able to sustain, you're able to survive it. And then there's anti-fragile, where you get exposed to risk and chaos and you actually thrive and grow in that environment. We're seeing a lot of companies and countries and industries who have built anti-fragile systems who are actually growing and thriving under these kind of, relatively austere conditions, and will really grow post. So rewarding companies, companies that are already seeing the rewards of some of that behavior, industries that are seeing the reward of that behavior, cultures that are seeing the reward of that particular kind of behavior, I think it's something that should be championed. And we should talk about how different nations and different organizations have had creative solutions, sometimes machine learning based, sometimes not, and have been able to really capitalize on the chaos that's ensued with this gigantic black swan event, and create that into, build that into subsequent systems.
Yeah, just to build on that, I think really important comments there. I think there's a few things. First of all, that I think if I could wave a magic wand, I would kind of want to know all the information. Where are the illnesses happening? Who's been sick before? Because we don't really have a good handle on that. Where the variants are, how is it spreading? Like all of that, it feels like having more of that information could help us to be able better to react and to respond. I think there's, some things that have emerged out of this. We've seen that the development of the vaccines in really record time, considering how long that process often will take. So I think there have been some advancements there. But I think the other thing to keep in mind is that technology can only take you so far. There's the leadership aspect, trust in science and public willingness, trying to make sure that the good information wins out compared to the other information out there. I think, all of these things are areas that we really do need to, kind of have better systems around. And I think for me, the key takeaway is really like trying to be more prepared ahead of time instead of trying to take a reactionary view, which, I think is partly is human nature and partly is oh, well, that's not going to happen, or, well, this is happening now, so it probably won't happen for a while. But, the data and the modeling show that this type of event actually will happen more frequently than people might expect. And so the important thing is to not, after we get past this, which we will, it's not to say, oh, well, that was really bad, and then kind of just forget the lessons and move on to the next crisis of the day. Like we really do need to do something about building public health resilience, building overall resilient economies to be better able to handle this type of event in the future.
Yeah, I think that's really well put. So we've got 2 minutes. So I would like to end on a high note, the case for optimism, okay? Because it's easy to get in here and say, oh man, we screwed up this, we screwed up that. Okay, but I'll give you my case for optimism. And it builds on what you just said, Nita. Talk about science doing amazing work to crank out a vaccine to something we haven't seen before in a record timetable and put it into a lot of people's arms. Incredible, right? And so my case for optimism is, I think humanity is this interesting thing, and that when pushed against the wall, we are amazingly innovative, and we can come together under the right conditions and make things happen. And so my case is, I actually think, as horribly tragic as this has been, and it continues to play out. I mean, we're not through it, but I also think, we learn, and I think we get better. And so I think that we are, relative to the state of preparedness we had, X months ago entering this, I want to believe that the macro state of preparedness is higher, just because of what we're living through. So that's my case of optimism. I think science is accelerating and our levels of preparedness is higher today and people are learning. But, I may just be the entrepreneurial optimist, so that's my view. So Charlie, your case for optimism.
Yeah, I love yours, and I'll double down on that. We had, within 48 hours, the sequencing coming out of Wuhan for the virus, we had a vaccine sequence as well. I mean, 48 hours. That's wild. That is like unbelievable. Now the time between when it was sequenced and then we actually got it out to the market is there are a lot of precautions that were taken, and rightfully so, but it's also true that it was caught up to some degree in bureaucracy that we could definitely optimize. But holy cow, I mean, for Big Pharma to figure out in 2 days how to get a solution to this problem created was really just tremendous. And I think a lot of thanks should go to the scientists who were behind that, and academics and industry scientists alike who came together to create this incredible technique.
Yeah, and we're about out of time. And as moderator, I've totally screwed something up. I was waiting for these attendee questions to pop, and they didn't auto-populate. So I apologize for that. So Nita, instead of your case for optimism, can you answer one question from the audience? And it's basically, I'm doing the first one that came in from Catherine. And the question is, what your fear index, your fear score, which was super cool, what are the elements in there? What are you using to actually measure fear? And with that, it's probably a wrap.
Yeah, quick one. So we're looking at information such as the case fatality ratio, how it's transmitted, the types of symptoms it causes, whether or not there are treatments and vaccines. So that's the type of information that we're gathering. It's informed by surveys we did in the general population a couple of years ago, just asking them questions like, okay, based on this list of symptoms, which one do you think is the most frightening? So we did it in different locations around the world as well to kind of get a sense of, how that might differ by area. And so we were able to do it for 100 prior events, and then now for COVID as well. So it's some pretty interesting stuff there.
Well, thank you all so much. I hope the audience got something out of this. I certainly did. Y'all are fantastic. Keep up the good work.